All right, my watch says 6:30, so we're going to start right on time tonight. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Samantha Twiggs, who's going to be giving the lecture tonight in the Global Public Health Lecture Series on Crisis Competency. And this lecture series is co-sponsored by the External Advisory Committee of the Global Public Health Program, which I direct, and also the Institute for Health and Humanities. So Samantha is completing her MPA, MCJ at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And she works as a technical analyst for Analytic Services. Analytic Services, or ANSER, is a nonprofit research institute that provides analysis on national security, homeland security, and public policy for the federal government. Samantha's undergraduate work was right here at the University of Montana in political science, I'm very proud to say, and that led her to UCCS, where she will graduate in May with her 2 degrees and additional certificates in Homeland Security and Emergency Management and National Intelligence Studies. Last year, Samantha participated in the NORAD and U.S. Northern Command Volunteer Student Internship Program. So as you can see, she's got the right qualifications for the talk that she's going to give us tonight. So Samantha, welcome. We're really happy you can be with us here tonight and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about crisis competency and how we understand our response in terms of public health consequences in modern military crises. So just to recap some of the things that Dr. Kern said about me. I did graduate from the University of Montana in 2017, where I participated in the political science program, as well as the global public health program, and a few other programs offered by the university as well. And so from there, I went into my career at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, where I'm currently working on 2 master's degrees and 2 certificates, which are focused on Homeland Security, Public Administration, and Emergency Management. So there tends to be a common theme between all of those. And then as mentioned by Dr. Kern, I did have the opportunity to participate in the NORAD and US Northcom internship program, where I was a DISCA instructor. So DISCA stands for Defense Support of Civil Authorities. And that is a program that teaches civil authorities such as mayors, governors, and other political figures how to use resources offered by the military and the Department of Defense in times of emergency. And so I was actually recently asked to come back and be an employee of that team. And so that's where I'm currently at. And as soon as this virus is over, we'll resume teaching people how to use those resources and access them during times of crisis. But right now at NORAD and US Northcom, our primary focus is using our resources to improve public response to this virus in any way possible. So to give you a brief overview of where we're going to go in this talk today, first we're going to talk about crisis management and how we build through the pillars of stability. We're going to talk about the regime type and economic capacity of systems. I'm going to talk about the hierarchy of resource expenditures, systemic vulnerabilities, and what those requirements are for effective crisis management. I'm also going to talk about state capacity and how that capacity is supplemented by foreign aid. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what types of foreign aid exist and what considerations should be made when we're discussing foreign aid in terms of crisis intervention. In the latter portion of my speech, I'm going to focus specifically on military aid and some of the concerns we have with military aid in terms of the recovery and rehabilitation process in conflict-prone and conflict-involved states. I'm going to briefly cover corruption, firearms, explosives, chemical weapons and herbicides, radiological munitions, and the effects of occupation when I discuss this. And then finally, I'm going to draw a specific reference to public health and discuss the final takeaways from that. And then I'll open myself up for any questions you guys may have. All right, so to start this talk, I'm going to focus specifically on the emergency management cycle, since that is my background in the last couple of years. So the figure on the left indicates the emergency management cycle. And typically when we have an emergency, we start where the red circle is that reads disaster. From here, we move through a series of steps in the clockwise direction. So we respond to the incident, we rehabilitate and recover from the incident, and then we take measures to try and prevent and mitigate that incident in the future, and then prepare for it if we can't prevent it. So surrounding these, in the middle of these steps are the 4 pillars of stability. And these are things that a society needs in order to accurately and effectively complete each portion of the emergency management cycle. So these 4 pillars include institutional capacity, social infrastructure, economic capital, and environmental health. So institutional capacity is the ability of institutions to create regulations, standards, and protocols, to implement these regulations, standards, and protocols, and to enforce them. So typically when we think of institutions, we think of governing bodies like the Supreme Court and Congress, or agencies that are responsible for making policies. However, this is not always the case, as some institutions may be responsible for enforcing social norms or producing behaviors in society. And so we need all of these institutions to come together in order to have institutional capacity. The second pillar is social infrastructure. Social infrastructure consists of the habits, knowledge, social and personal attributes that are needed to sustain labor and economic development and promote well-being. And this includes things such as social norms, such as formal education and informal education, and the behaviors in social societies, And so a lot of human infrastructure is made up of human capital, which is the formal training and skills that are developed within a human population to promote labor and economic development and to deploy a workforce. However, social infrastructure also consists of socially cohesive measures, or how well bonded that society is. If the society is not cohesive, then they are less likely to support initiatives put forth or to coordinate their efforts to gain traction throughout institutions and society as a whole. So the third pillar is economic capital. And at its most basic form, economic capital is the financial resources that are available to support both consumptive and capital measures throughout a workforce. So this includes money, it includes economic activity, and it includes capital investments in things such as technology or advanced processes and procedures. And then finally, we have environmental health. So environmental health just means that people are operating in a safe, sustainable environment that allows those activities to occur. Whenever anything happens that threatens their safety or their security, we say that they're not able to produce economic capital. They're not interested in the institutions. They're just interested in sustaining themselves and surviving. So environmental health also plays a very key part in this emergency management cycle. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the regime type and how that relates to economic capacity. So economic capacity is the ability or the availability of resources to a regime or to a society. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, this is composed of the resources that are available and the ability of the state to employ those resources. So the second component of this is the regime type. And this is how the government is structured and how the power is distributed within society. So the graph on the right indicates that there are autocratic societies and democratic societies. And most societies fall somewhere between the spectrum of autocratic and democratic. And then we also see that there are countries that have high amounts of reserves and low reserves. And so we see that there's a correlation between countries that have high economic reserves that tend to have democratic institutions. However, there are some countries that are democratic that do not have very many economic reserves, and there are some countries that are autocratic and that have significant amounts of reserves. And so this again relates back to economic capacity. So in a democratic society, the power is distributed, as are the resources and the access to those resources. They're decentralized to the lowest levels of society. However, in autocratic countries, these resources are concentrated in the upper echelons of government and society. And so these governments have the potential and the ability to safeguard their position based on the amount of economic reserves that they have. And that gives them some stability in terms of their autocratic status. So both of these are necessary for discussing how social infrastructure develops. When people are isolated from the government, they're not likely to be cohesive. There's likely to be a lot of contention and social strife because they don't have access to the resources that they need. However, in democratic societies, they're represented in the government. They're not isolated from their resources and political representation. So there's less likely to be the civil strife and discontent that we see in some societies. Okay, in this slide, I'm talking about how we fulfill our needs in a society, and I'm going to start in the square that reads consumptive needs. So in this square, we're talking about needs such as food, water, clothing, shelter, sanitation, education, and healthcare. These are needs that individuals absolutely must have in order to survive at the basic level. And there are two trajectories that can occur from this level. So first, if states are unable to meet these basic needs, they may fall below the threshold of survival into a state of emergency. In the state of emergency, people regularly forego their basic needs, either through a lack of access or just other conditions that might force them to have to forego these types of things. And this can be temporary or this can be permanent, depending on the ability of the government to mobilize resources to meet those basic needs. In the other direction, we see that if a government and a country are able to meet their consumptive needs and they have excess capital available, they can start to put that towards their capital improvements. So when we invest in capital improvements, that includes things such as infrastructure, technology, public governance, and political and economic stability. The capital improvements allow the country to start moving into a more developed state where they can continue to invest in these things and continue to use these resources to meet their needs and meet the expectations of the global community. So if the country has yet more excess revenue and more capital, they can put that towards luxury goods. And these are items that are largely based on the amount of disposable income an individual or country have, and they are designed to improve the quality of life, although they're not necessary to the basic needs of the country. So when we talk about this pyramid, it's important to understand how resources are distributed. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that autocratic and highly centralized governments tend to collect resources in order to retain their power and status. So in highly centralized societies, we see that there is a large income disparity because the elites are looking for goods that can make them look more powerful, that can preserve their power. So often because they have access to so many resources, we see that they have a lot of luxury goods, whereas the people may be in a state of emergency or barely above the threshold of survival. Whereas in democratic or highly decentralized countries, we see that these resources are more egalitarian because people have more control over their access to those resources and their ability to purchase those resources. Although it's not always true that democratic societies and highly centralized societies have better distribution, it is more likely given the power that the individual has rather than the government. So this slide demonstrates the systemic vulnerabilities that are apparent in a country that might contribute to its inability to develop. And so we have two different traps that a country could fall in. The first is a conflict trap, and the second is a poverty trap. So the red brick colored diagram on the top indicates the stages of a conflict trap. So with a conflict trap, we see that people enter into some sort of conflict, whether it be small or large. And from that conflict, they see a loss of resources. So for example, if someone's in a fight, they might lose time or they might lose some of their possessions in order to compensate for that fight or during that fight. However, as the conflict becomes more intensive, we see more widespread damage, such as the loss of structures or the loss of personnel. So we see from the loss of resources that contributes to economic stagnation and recession. And so from here, people are receiving less income because there are fewer opportunities, fewer resources being put into the economy. And when there's lower income and resource scarcity, that contributes to more conflict because people are now using violent or desperate measures in order to regain what they had before or in order to secure their basic needs. On the second diagram on the bottom, it demonstrates the poverty trap. And so this trap largely occurs when poverty becomes a systemic problem within societies. And so it starts with low income. When people have low to no income, that means that they have no savings. And without savings, they're not able to invest. If you recall, we indicated that they have to satisfy their basic needs before they can purchase more advancements. So for example, somebody has to be able to feed themselves before they can purchase education in order to offer themselves better opportunities. So if there's no income, they're not able to purchase education, and that means that they're not growing economically. And this is true for the individual or the society. And so in some societies, these traps exist exclusively by themselves. However, we often see that the two traps are nested within each other. So conflict leads to a loss of resources, which leads to low income, and then people have low savings, low economic stagnation, and so on until we're seeing an escalation of conflict once again, and then we restart the cycle. So it's important to understand how these traps relate to effective crisis management. So at every stage of the crisis management cycle, there are specific requirements that have to be met. And I've broken these requirements down into equipment requirements, knowledge requirements, and personnel requirements. And it's important to note that as each step increases, it requires more intensive investments. So in the response stage, we see that people need, or societies need, response vehicles, machinery to fulfill those functions, warning systems, and perhaps some sort of monitoring equipment to monitor the development of the situation. However, when we try to talk about preparing for the situation, we need the same modeling equipment, but we need risk analysis programs. Like how susceptible are we to these programs, and how much of a risk does it pose to our society? We need to be able to maintain and improve our response equipment and personnel. And this includes providing threat detection equipment, such as radar, seismographic technology, and biological testing. And we also need to start to develop emergency supplies. So not only basic supplies, but also what happens if we have an emergency, supplies that we would need in that situation, such as additional food, water, equipment, and mass care resources. However, if we are unable to meet our basic needs, we are likely to be unable to meet more advanced needs. So if we refer back to the hierarchy of resource expenditures, we can see that we might not even have enough resources to respond to the incident, but we're not going to have the resources to prepare for that incident, especially because any incident that occurs will use those resources. And so it kind of just increases with all of the stages, whether it's equipment, knowledge, or people. So we have to be able to employ people. We have to be able to do so in a safe, sustainable environment so we can recreate that environment and reintegrate those people and those resources into society, whether that's by recreating those resources, improving those resources, or restoring those resources. So in this slide, I talk about state capacity. So as I mentioned, states who cannot fulfill their consumptive and capital needs are unlikely to have the human capital, financial capital, or administrative capital to fully rehabilitate, prepare, or prevent future incidents. People who are unable to obtain education are unlikely to be useful in administering highly technological problems or monitoring situations. And similarly, if we have a government that isn't interested in adjusting policies in order to serve the best interests of the people, those policies are unlikely to reflect risks that could happen to the people. They're just more likely to reflect risks that could happen to the government itself. So like they're not intended to be society focused. So the diagram on the left indicates, again, the emergency management cycle, but the difference in this is that it indicates the diminishment of resources that occur as developing countries attempt to recover from events. So if they're unable to rehabilitate those systems, or if they're unable to recover their equipment, that is a loss that the society suffers. And that means going forward, they have fewer resources to respond to fewer incidents or to more incidences. And incidents can have varying effects depending on the type, magnitude, and frequency of the event. So events that occur more frequently are likely to give the state a shorter period of time to respond to and recover from that event. Whereas states that are more intense or more have longer intensity are more likely to take more resources, again, leaving them with less opportunity to recover and redevelop those resources before the next incident. So one way that state capacity is improved is if foreign aid can supplement the state capacity. So if foreign aid can provide additional equipment, technical expertise, or even funding, it can help the society recover faster. And we see that a lot with natural disasters in foreign countries where foreign aid is provided to at least partially subsidize the society until it can get back on its feet. So there are two predominant models of foreign aid. And the first is the Berlin-Washington Consensus model. And so this model was initiated after the end of World War II, when the United States provided significant amounts of foreign aid to a lot of European countries who were recovering from the effects of World War II. And it's predominantly predicated on the idea that resource allocation is better achieved through privatization, limited government intervention, and reduced public spending. These policies were put forth as a measure of structural adjustment, which was largely endorsed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, because they argued that the cost of government failure would outweigh the cost of market failure. And this means that they thought that the cost of government failure would be more excessive than the small corrections that the market would make by itself, partially because it would take longer for the government to correct it, and partially because those steps away from the true market balance would be greater than the market would produce itself. The second model is the Beijing Consensus model, and this was introduced by Beijing, and it introduced the idea that institutional development was a foundation to economic development. And the predicator of this model is the idea of dirigism, which is the idea that free markets have to operate in heavily regulated and state-controlled environment. So this leads to the idea that institutional development is imperative because you have to have strong institutions in order to have a strong state-controlled environment. This model is largely produced by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB. And this model has become the dominant model in foreign aid across the world, partially because there were a number of economic failures that occurred as a result of the structural adjustment policies in the 1960s and 70s, and partially because Asian economies that have been bolstered by the AIIB have demonstrated significant resilience during economic downturn. And so several members of NATO have started to endorse this model as the dominant model in foreign aid distribution. So in the bottom right corner is the 17 development goals. And regardless of which model is endorsed, these are the goals agreed upon by the international community that should be met in developing countries in order to support development in those countries. So we have 6 different types of foreign aid. The first type of foreign aid is bilateral aid, and this is aid that is given directly between governments in order to establish long-term economic, political, and humanitarian relationships. The second type of aid we had is multilateral aid, and this is aid that is pooled between donors and then given to specific projects. So this type of aid is largely distributed through organizations such as the World Bank, the United Nations, and the International Monetary Fund. And it allows countries that may not have as much economic power to support bilateral aid to at least have some stake in development projects, but it also allows countries to form coalitions in who they support with their foreign aid. So the third type of aid is tied aid, and this is aid that has some sort of stipulation that requires the recipient to purchase food or military aid or any other type of aid, either from the donor country, from a company within the donor, or requires specific purchases to be made with that aid. The fourth type of aid is project aid, and this is aid that's given to fund a specific project. Oftentimes, these types of aid are directed towards schools or hospitals or building some sort of permanent infrastructure in a country, but it's just focused on that one structure at the moment. The fifth type of aid is voluntary aid, and this is aid that's provided through volunteer organizations, and it includes things such as volunteers, donation supplies, and relief aid. A prominent example of voluntary aid is the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, who deploy volunteers across the world, regardless of the type of incident or the scope of the incident or who's involved in the incident. And then finally, we have military aid. So military aid provides direct military support, funding, or training to improve the military capabilities of another country. Okay, so when we discuss foreign aid, there are several considerations that should be kept in mind. And first and foremost is that foreign aid is a relationship that is characterized by financial and social exchange. So the financial value of that exchange is agreed upon and it's set at the time of the interaction. However, the social value is not always set or guaranteed based on the type of behaviors present in each country. Social exchange is highly dependent on the type of culture in the country and the cultural context in which that relationship occurs. Some countries and cultures endorse the idea of obligations, favors, or loyalties, whereas others do not. And so if there's an expectation of loyalty or obligation to the donor, and that expectation is not shared by the recipient, it can cause conflict or contention over the social value of that interaction. The second consideration is that foreign aid is a foreign policy tool, and it is used to create stability, protect interest, and develop a shared value system. So in some way, shape, or form, the donor expects to receive something in return for their foreign aid. And this goes to the value, their socially expected value when they give that aid. And so because of this, this makes the donor very partial in who they distribute aid to. And so we've seen that foreign donors are more likely to give to countries or organizations that share similar political and economic systems, who have had historical relationships with the donor, or who are geographically proximate to the donor. And this is because the donor shares some of the vulnerability that the recipient is sharing. Geographically proximate states may produce refugees that the donor has to deal with, and by giving them a foreign aid donation, they may alleviate some of the vulnerability that they may experience to refugees, or the failures in political economic systems may cause instability in their own economic systems, so they're trying to reduce that vulnerability by bolstering their capacity with foreign aid. Next, it's important to realize that the effectiveness of foreign aid is highly disputed. Some individuals believe that it hasn't been used enough to bolster significant results. Others believe that it causes significant problems for the developing country, such as dependency or fosters corruption. And so there's a wide spectrum of evaluations of foreign aid. And determining a precise answer is difficult because there is limited transparency within aid organizations and within countries themselves. So a lot of times aid organizations or agencies provide aid with little conditions and little transparency or reporting requirements back to the public and to the people providing that aid. And there's also a lot of duplication across agencies because they're not communicating and transparent with other agencies in the same line of work. So that complicates assessing how effective foreign aid is. Now, as I mentioned, it's also difficult to assess transparency in the countries that it's being given to. It's really difficult to measure how much of the aid is going to those who need it and how much is being siphoned into other purposes, such as the maintenance of patron relationships, ghost accounts, and personal financing. If countries are determined to keep those resources away from people and to bolster their own security, it is more likely that they are going to use those for corrupt purposes rather than distributing it. And this is especially true with certain types of aid. For example, food aid during famines or other crises may be siphoned into the pockets and relationships that are established by elite networks within the governments, rather than going to the people that it's intended to reach. And then finally, I just want to note that strategic aid is pretty ineffective in achieving humanitarian development because there's no incentive to direct money towards humanitarian needs. This can be, again, exemplified by my example of food aid. When the government can use that food aid, they're not going to distribute it to the people who need it because it secures their strategic position. And this is the same with a lot of military aid because it's directly supporting strategic objectives and it doesn't really involve the humanitarian needs as much as it should. So I'm going to focus exclusively on military aid because unlike other forms of aid, military aid has the potential to be disastrous to the recovery and rehabilitation cycle. But first, it's important to understand what is military aid. So military aid comes in a variety of forms and can include funding, training, exercise support, arms sales, or direct support through personnel. So there are a number of concerns that can arise from the introduction of military aid into societies, especially when they lack the institutional capacity to handle that aid, to account for that aid, and to ensure that that aid doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So the first potential is corruption, and corruption applies regardless of what type of military aid we provide. Funds that are provided to purchase anything from uniforms to weapons may be diverted into personal accounts. The presence of nepotism may also interfere with training and personnel requirements. meaning the government may only put forth individuals that it sees that are related to it in order to bolster its position and its security, rather than people who are actually in those organizations or people who the training is actually supposed to reach. And especially when we come to weapons, we see that there might be additional concerns, such as the fact that weapons might be sold to non-state actors, or they may be intercepted and stolen through intentional information leaks. So governments may do this intentionally or unintentionally, especially if it offers them some sort of ideological, economic, or political advantage. However, these 2 points create specific vulnerabilities for the donors of those weapons, especially when it comes to the United States. If we are not sure who the weapons are being sold to or what their intentions are, those weapons may be used against us, against our allies, and against the people we're trying to help. And because we don't know where they're going or how they're being used, it means that it's not predictable for us to determine when they may be used against us. And then the last point regarding corruption is that the information regarding our deployed forces, especially if they're deployed in that country, may be compromised. And again, this may occur due to ideological motivations or any political or economic advantage that's perceived. And so again, this puts our forces and our personnel in direct risk of being in danger. And so the last 3 points indicate that when we're not able to account for that aid or where it's going, it can be extremely detrimental to the United States and other foreign donors. So the first type of military aid I'm going to talk about is firearms. And firearms are obviously have the ability to cause permanent bodily injury and death, but they're among the most accessible weapons during any conflict. And there are also environmental concerns that exceed the physical concerns that can cause long-term difficulties and long-term political health or public health challenges. And that's largely because of the components that are used to make firearms and the ammunitions. Most prominently, we have lead, but ammunitions also include other heavy metals such as arsenic, antimony, cadmium, zinc, and copper. And many of these components are banned in the US and the EU because of their effect on the environment, because they're linked to soil and water contamination, because they're linked to massive extinctions and die-offs in fish and waterfowl populations, and because they cause direct physiological effects to humans, including psychological degradation and impaired cognitive function. They may also see cancerous developments and genetic changes depending on how heavily saturated lead and other heavy metals are in the environment. So we see that firearms cause immediate public health concerns, such as injury and casualties, but they also contribute to long-term public health effects that can be damaging not only in one generation, but also down the line in multiple generations. So these chemicals these compounds can be removed from the environment, but this is an extremely timely and cost-consuming process. Germany has attempted to remediate the impact of lead ammunitions from World War II, but it has done so unsuccessfully over the last several decades. So if a country like Germany is having difficulty remediating these problems, it is unlikely that countries with far fewer economic and political resources are going to be able to remediate these problems at all. So the second type of military aid are explosives. And explosives are delivered through ground-based or aerial methods, depending on the specific type of explosive being used. So most obviously, explosives damage the environment by causing the demolition of structures, vehicles, and fire hazards. But they also remove natural plant filters, soil filters, and water. And they leave behind debris such as shrapnel and chemical residue, but they can also leave behind unexploded ordnances. And I'll come back to those in just a minute. And then finally, they increase airborne hazards that can be inhaled and ingested by people within the zone of explosion. So within explosives, there are a number of chemical compounds, such as chlorine, phosphorus, nitrate, and sulfur, that are highly toxic to plants and animals, and are again highly toxic to humans. So the biggest issue with explosives is unexploded devices. And a lot of times we think of landmines or hidden bombs that haven't been exploded on impact. And these are detrimental because they make it dangerous for people to reintegrate into their hometowns or into areas where these have been spread, but they're also damaging to animals. So animals such as livestock or wildlife who happen to come across these can obviously die or be significantly injured. And this means that people have less opportunity to reintegrate into society, and it means that they have fewer opportunities to use land for economic activities such as farming or fuel gathering or logging, should they happen to come across these. And a lot of times we see that it's children who are the unfortunate victims of these unexploded ordinances. And so that can cause death, or it can cause a series of lifelong emotional, physical, and mental complications that the society now has to deal with and work through. And this is concerning because the Geneva Convention indicates that any sort of explosive, especially landmines, have to be marked. However, they are often still intentionally disguised and hidden in order to incur damage to enemy forces. So overall, they can be extremely hazardous to public health, and they can cause a long range of problems, both short-term and long-term. And this is another problem that can be remedied, but is extremely time-consuming and money-intensive. The next category of military aid I'm going to talk about is chemical weapons and herbicides. So chemical weapons and herbicides come in a variety of forms and functions. And so each chemical pest or chemical weapon and herbicide varies based on its specific construction and consistency. However, a lot of times we see that these are highly corrosive and highly persistent substances that permanently alter ecosystems through contamination. And most immediately, when people are exposed to these type of agents, they feel or they see immediate physical implications such as burns, asphyxiation, rashes, choking, and blistering. And many times there are no antidotes to these, and antidotes that do exist are expensive and may be widely unavailable due to production costs. And so remedying these is difficult, if not impossible, in some societies. But we have seen a surge in chemical attacks with the ongoing incidents in Syria and the weapons being used there. However, we also see a number of herbicides, especially when it comes to operations within that country that require land clearing or immediate defoliation. And so this is highly problematic because a lot of herbicides and chemical weapons are highly carcinogenic, and they result in a number of genetic manifestations that can occur over generations. And again, they can be highly difficult to remove. And so in Vietnam, when we used herbicides such as napalm, this caused permanent ecological loss and persistence of those chemical pesticides throughout the environment. So as a result, especially in Vietnam, where they were used so heavily, there was a significant loss of habitat, which led to a decrease in the sustainability of various animal populations. And many of these animals were relied on as a source of food, but we also see that these types of weapons and tactics leached into water systems. And so they were highly effective in killing various fish populations, which were also a major source of food for the Vietnamese people. And so that loss of habitat and the damage to the ecological health of the environment and the species within that environment continues to cause problems for the people in Vietnam today. They're unable to support fisheries. They're unable to recover those fisheries and other populations that were lost. And so it continues to have implications in their food chain supply today. The next type of military aid is radiological munitions. Typically, when we think of radiological munitions, we think of the nuclear bomb. However, this has only been used once, but it's been tested numerous times on various environments. And we see that it's very highly destructive to physical surroundings. Almost immediately, everything within proximity of the nuclear detonation is exposed to radiation and completely eliminated. And this radiation that is created at the explosion site is not isolated to that area. We've seen that it's carried through various processes to other parts of the world, leading to long-term contamination of environments, and especially areas where those bombs were detonated. So although we don't use those anymore because they've largely been removed from military arsenals through the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we do see other radiological munitions such as depleted uranium rounds. So DU rounds are radioactive rounds that use radioactive particulate to create explosions. However, as this radioactive particulate explodes, it causes it to settle into other environments and other people or animals within that environment. So almost immediately, people that are involved in depleted uranium round strikes are casualties of conflict. Most people do not survive a depleted uranium round, particularly because of its rapid combustion and because those occur in largely confined spaces such as tanks and armored vehicles. However, when it is spread through wind and other patterns, it is ingested into animals, plants, and humans, and that continues to accumulate throughout their lifetime. And so, like the effects of nuclear bombs, this can cause severe mutations, the development of cancerous growths, and other health conflicts that are difficult to resolve and often impossible to resolve. So here again, we see that a military technology is detrimental to the environment and to people living in that environment because it causes medical problems that the society now has to resolve. And while the society is attempting to resolve that, people within that society are dealing with the effects of that, whether it be cancerous growths or intergenerational mutagenic developments. And when countries don't have the resources to purchase the radiological decontamination sites or procedures, then these people are less likely to receive the medical health care that they need unless they move somewhere else or it can be provided through foreign assistance. So the final type of military aid that I'm going to talk about is occupation. And so occupation creates a number of problems for the environment, especially as occupying forces utilize resources to sustain themselves, try to destroy resources to prevent others from using them, or just damage resources out of boredom. So in any manner that resources are destroyed, it means that there are less resources for people within that society to use. And this can cause a number of problems. For example, in Afghanistan, when the Soviets first invaded, or Russia first invaded, they heavily relied on burn and scorched earth tactics and to destroy Afghani crops. So out of these tactics arose massive famines and starvation that caused additional problems that the government had to rely on because that resource was seen as a strategic advantage. And by taking away that resource, they could take away any advantage to any opposition throughout Afghanistan. However, these policies continue to cause significant problems for Afghanistan because many of the forest resources in Afghanistan were also destroyed by the scorch and burn tactics of the USSR. And so that means that in the present day, people are unable to use logging or fuel gathering as a source of economic activity. So although short-term crops may have recovered, providing them some source of food, they also lost economic opportunity that prevents them from seeking other opportunities or seeking advancement in their society. And then we have environmental damage that may occur as a result of regular operations. And these include pollution, surface hardening operations, and land clearing operations, such as building permanent infrastructure buildings, such as buildings, roads, and landing strips. And these effects are not seen immediately. These effects occur throughout several decades as that presence continues. And these effects may cause things such as air hazards or inhalation hazards to people in those areas, but they may also draw attention from oppositional forces that incur attacks or additional conflict. For example, infrastructures such as roads and buildings may become a strategic target for that individual or that opposition group to attack, meaning that anybody in that vicinity may be in danger if that is a strategic priority. So in this slide, I just want to give a brief overview of what I've talked about and how it relates to public health. So, and how it relates to the 4 pillars of stability as well. So first we see that there is an institutional component. And when we have conflict that is exacerbated by foreign technologies and foreign advantages, we see that this has a very problematic effects for institutions, many of whom lose physical infrastructures, lose personnel, and lose public support. And so when we see these aggregated consequences, that leads to an inability of institutions to fund emerging health programs or problems, an inability to garner support for public health officials, and no capacity to rapidly mobilize resources during a crisis. Next, if we look at the environmental aspects, we see that a lot of these technologies lead to contaminated food chains, water sources, and soil areas. They also reduce the food supply, which increases malnutrition and food insecurity, and they permanently alter the environment, reducing the availability of food and resources for the sustainment of people. Now, one of the largest sectors impacted by conflict is the social infrastructure. Oftentimes, conflicts are predicated on identity or isolating one group from another in order to bolster or to destabilize social cohesion. And so this leads to increased and ongoing tensions between various races and cultural identities and between different genders, especially in conflicts where gendered violence is a tactic used by the powerful in the country. So this can contribute to a number of tensions that undermine social support for programs. It also means that people within these groups that have previously competed against each other and who retain grievances against members of the other group are unlikely to come together and work with them. They're less likely to support campaigns that would bring the community together and heal these divides. We also see that there's a loss of medical professionals. Often, medical professionals are on the front line, and so they're the most vulnerable people within the professional sector because they are on the front line, making them more vulnerable to a conflict or casualty or injury. But we've also seen throughout numerous conflicts that medical professionals may emigrate out of the country in order to improve their likelihood of surviving or proffering. And so we see that either way, through immigration or through casualties, there is a significant loss of medical professionals. There also may be a distrust of medical professionals that develops. And some campaigns have utilized medical professionals as a front while they carry out covert operations. And once their operations have been discovered, it's led to a distrust of medical professionals. And so when people don't trust medical professionals, they're unlikely to seek out their advice or their treatment when there is something wrong. And we saw this specifically in the Ebola crisis, where the people were unwilling to go to the medical professionals to seek treatment due to fear or social stigma. And as a result, we continue to see increases in cases where we would see a decrease, and then we would see an increase, and then a decrease again. And so trust of medical professionals, especially during times of crisis, is especially key to recovery and rehabilitation. As I've mentioned several times, we also see significant increases in the number of disabilities, disfigurements, and trauma that people are experiencing. These are all problems that the community has to overcome in order to recover. They have to find ways to treat these disabilities, treat these disfigurements, and heal this trauma within society. Otherwise, we're not improving the individual and national capacities associated with this. We also see that conflict causes a number of internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. And when people are in these statuses, their health considerations are often far poorer than people that are within society. Numerous refugee camps have been cited for poor sanitation, gendered violence, and a number of other public health problems that the international community has to respond to. And then finally, there's the loss of culturally significant sites, artifacts, personnel, and rituals, which may contribute to that trauma or the necessary grievances that need to be overcome in order for a society to recover. And then finally, we have the loss of economic opportunities, the loss of human capital, and most importantly, the loss of external investment interest. So as conflicts occur and people become more unstable, or societies become more unstable, that signifies to the international community that their investment is not safe, that their investment is being lost either through destruction or through corruption. And so we see that there is a loss of interest in investing, a loss of interest in re-promoting those societies. But as I've mentioned, external investment is key and imperative to recovering those societies because they don't have the capital to recover those systems themselves. And so across the board, if any one of these is damaged or weakened, it makes it more difficult for the society to respond. So if we're talking about societies that already have limited resources, that already have difficulty in protecting their public or meeting their basic needs, any sort of conflict is going to detract from the availability of resources, meaning their ability to recover and rehabilitate has now been made even more difficult. They now have a deficit to recover from before they can even return to their previous status before that event occurred. And so that's why it's incredibly important to understand how and when foreign aid can be most useful. So a few key takeaways is that conflict damages and eliminates any source of political, social, and cultural capability, as I just discussed. Especially when we consider how military aid that is directed at strategic objectives can open the gateway for enhanced damage by providing advanced technology and tactics that might otherwise not have been present in society. Again, as I mentioned, states have a renewed and worsened source of systemic problems that they must now deal with and that they now have to do so with fewer resources. And because of these issues, Conflict-oriented military aid does not supplement the ability of states to recover and rehabilitate from conflicts, but it creates additional hurdles that must be overcome before states can return to their or pre-conflict condition and then improve. And so, as I discussed, even if these problems do not appear to be related to the public health sector, many of them do develop into public health problems that require advanced resources, advanced tactics, and advanced processes in order to do so. But it requires all four pillars for societies to be able to address these problems and move forward. So this is the end of my talk, and so I will open myself up to any questions or considerations that anyone wants to talk about. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you. Thank you so much for a very impressive overview and a really thoughtful presentation. It has us thinking now, I think, more deeply about the implications of military conflict and some of the short-term and long-term consequences of this that we often overlook. So I really appreciated that. I've got some questions, but let's see what the rest of the audience has in mind first.
And this is Kelly, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will monitor that and pass them on to Sam if she doesn't see them.
Sam, I'm wondering whether you have run across any instances where foreign aid or military aid has had positive impacts on a public health system.
There are definite instances where the foreign aid has had positive effects. And so in order to distinguish between that, I focus specifically on military aid because it doesn't focus on bolstering systems in the traditional sense. However, there are certain military programs that are used to improve the capacity of medical systems and public health systems. And the DoD provides those components through research and development by employing personnel and by associating some of that training into their humanitarian efforts. Recently in the United States, the Department of Defense deployed numerous medical capabilities across the entire country. And when the hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, they also sent their two comfort ships, the USNS Mercy and the USNS Comfort, which are military-equipped hospital ships to assist in their medical components. However, these are not usually deployed during conflict situations. They usually tend to stay close to the United States.
Thank you.
Well, while I'm waiting for some other questions to develop in people's minds, let me ask you mine. So I was very pleased to see toward the end that you connected some of the social infrastructure impacts with population displacement. And that's a subject that I addressed in my book on transnational migration and global health. I think it was the Doctors Without Borders who had this really thought-provoking quote at one point in time where they said, the greatest killer is flight. And so for people who are displaced because of armed conflict, they often find that all of their resources are lost, their social networks are totally disrupted, and hospitals have been destroyed. And as you pointed out, medical professionals who are on the front lines have often been lost. And so it really is a huge burden for those people who are on the move to get any kind of health care coverage along the way. And so during that process of moving, they're particularly vulnerable, not only in refugee camps, as you pointed out. So that's more of a comment than a question, but maybe you have something you'd like to add to that.
Yes, absolutely. And even when they are settled, they may experience additional vulnerabilities. For example, they may have difficulty integrating into that society, or they may be the subject of violence or attacks because of their origin. And we saw that on numerous occasions with immigrants who were affiliated with Muslim countries or practiced the Muslim faith after the 9/11 attacks. And so even after they're settled in well-established countries, they may experience violence or difficulty integrating, meaning they're not accessing healthcare networks like they need to be.
Other questions? You can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or do it via chat, and Kelly will ask the question for you. Samantha, this might not be a fair question. I was thinking when you were talking about the pillars of stability, when you were talking about the requirements for effective crisis management, I was thinking about the current pandemic crisis that we're encountering right now. Does that model help us at all in understanding what we're going through right now? And is there any place that you would point to there where you would say, we really failed in terms of effective crisis management, or maybe you would say we really succeeded? I'm not sure, as I said, it's a fair question because it's off the subject of your talk, but maybe you'd have some insights for us on that.
No, I agree. Thank you. So first, I do think that some parts of this model can be applied. So the United States has very strong institutions, and we're well known for having strong institutions that tend to balance each other out. However, one of the institutional failures that has come out of this is that there is a lot of government distrust, and there's a lot of social incohesion and a lack of support for those public policies. So whether it's because of political affiliation or general distrust of the government, we're seeing that a lot of people don't want to trust what the media or what the public officials are saying. And so this is giving us a varied response to the current crisis, where some people are sticking to what the directions and guidelines are, whereas other people are not, and they don't see the value in them. So I think first and foremost, that's the most applicable part of my model. But I also think that the model benefits us because it demonstrates that social cohesion really is an important aspect of response and recovery. One of the things that we see in the midst of a crisis, especially like this, is we see a lot of neighborly developments. People go out of their way to check on their neighbors, to try and integrate their neighbors and make sure that they are safe and taken care of. And so that demonstrates that social infrastructures and social relationships can really help us move through this crisis and become better acquainted and more cohesive as we emerge from this crisis. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you very much. I think we might have another question now.
I have one from Sue in the chat. She asks, when the U.S. decides to invade a country, who is in charge of deciding how the country will be affected environmentally? In Iraq in 2003, there was terrible environmental degradation. Is there someone who is consulted? And there's another question after that.
Okay, to answer the first question, I don't know specifically if somebody is consulted. We do have individuals in the United States who create impact assessments and stuff like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always consulted. And when we invade a country specifically, I don't think we consult with their government about the apparent degradation. When we leave a country or when a conflict is resolved, the United Nations prepares a post-evaluation assessment. And so this assessment serves as the primary indicator of what type of damage occurred and who's responsible. And so that's really where we see any accountability occurring for environmental degradation. But this relates back to the institutional pillar and the fact that many of these countries where these crises are occurring don't have the institutional capacity to monitor or correct environmental problems. And even in well-developed countries, environmental problems are often the least prioritized problem or agency in any government. So in countries that are struggling to adapt their institutions, we almost see limited to no existential involvement of any sort of environmental agency, especially as they're preoccupied with other issues and other instances.
And the second one is from Mary Nielsen, and it's not a question, but she says, it's not a question, but I could not help but think of our current worldwide crisis right now during this talk. And if we applied some of this, maybe things could have been different. Excellent job.
Thank you. And I definitely agree. And as I hinted at with the Ebola incident, the more that we endorse these pillars and the more that we try to improve and integrate them, the better that we can be at identifying threats, preventing them and mitigating the dangers of these threats, but also preparing for the next one. So anytime we see a global pandemic, we always see a series of lessons learned. And so anytime we can better integrate those lessons learned into our frameworks, our institutions, and our society, we can improve and mitigate the harm of the next one.
That's certainly a very important message that you're giving us. I'm going to take the liberty as chair to call on someone here who we haven't heard from yet, but who I think has a very similar interest to yours, and that is Alexandra. Alexandra, would you care to comment at all on what Samantha's been sharing with us today?
I have lots of comments, but just going back to the lessons learned comment that just came in, I would urge you to use the language lessons observed, because many of the lessons, many of the observations we make on these, we don't learn them because we go back and we do exactly the same thing the next time. So if we're truly learning a lesson from any of this emergency management, emergency preparedness, then we would see evidence of that with the next incident. And very frequently we get to make the same mistakes over and over again. One of my colleagues in emergency management continually urges us to talk about lessons observed, not lessons learned. I think I rarely see that written out that way, but I think it's a good thing to think about, because it goes back to what you often talk about with evaluation, Peter. It's like, was it really a lesson learned? If you evaluated afterward, was it learned? And I think that maybe there's in the evaluations and assessment that you often urge, Peter. It'd be interesting to see what the criteria for evaluation is for a lesson rather than observed. Just observed, and who's making the criteria up? Is it the military? Is it the population in the location that's just gone through the disaster or emergency or war, conflict? Or is it the U.S.? Is it the other countries? Is it the world? Is it the United Nations? It's like, where are the criteria coming from? So leave it at that. It actually is interesting, the emergency management cycle that used domestically and within FEMA, etc., does look somewhat different than the one that you showed, Samantha, in some of the steps, which I thought was interesting.
Well, unfortunately, I think we didn't catch all of your statement because you're coming in and out, but I think I could maybe try to summarize a little bit what you said. I think you were making a strong argument for evaluation, arguing that if we have a good evaluation, maybe we wouldn't make some of the same mistakes that we make over and over again otherwise. And then you were asking, you know, who sets the criteria for evaluation, that's a very important part of the evaluation process. And we really need to make sure that those criteria are set independently rather than set perhaps by the military themselves. So maybe if you just tell us if that's close enough, then maybe Samantha would have a few things to say about that, but unfortunately we couldn't hear all of your statement, Alexandra.
Sorry about that. Okay, I think that's pretty close. And I think putting this in the context of the dentist who talked several weeks ago, he had worked in Puerto Rico, I believe, he had worked in Haiti. And some of the observations that he made, because he was coming in through essentially military aid to another country, which was kind of interesting. Do you want to say something about that, Peter? About the Samantha, did you hear the one with the dentist who was part of the Army, the reserves?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that lecture.
I mean, in some ways, that was their work in Haiti was quite positive and working in the, you know, with the people. I think maybe one of the differences, and can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure where the mic is on this thing. Domestically and internationally, we talk a lot about whole community planning, whole community preparedness. And it'd be interesting to hear how that plays out in your military models that you described. It's like this, instead of like a top-down kind of military approach, it's like bringing people up from so the entire community is represented. So.
Okay, I think that gives Samantha some things you might want to comment on.
Sure. So to address your first comment, the standards and the evaluation criteria vary widely by each organization that's committed to that evaluation. And so some standards may be completely different, whereas others may overlap. And even when we revisit exercises or incidents, we may continue to draw things that we can implement in areas where we can see improvement. So there's no definitive body that sets those standards. When it comes to crises such as pandemics, those are set by public health institutions, but also by the industries and sectors that are impacted by that. And I definitely agree with your statement that there is room for improvement, and there are ways and instances where we can better implement those lessons learned. So thank you for bringing that forward. In regards to your second comment, part of the difference between my discussion and the discussion of humanitarian assets is that I am focused on assets that are deployed by a foreign military for the specific purpose of strategic or military engagement. So I didn't focus on military aid such as humanitarian aid because obviously that bolsters community improvement. It helps them respond and recover. And I chose to focus specifically on conflict-based military aid because we do see very dramatic, instantaneous decreases in capabilities in countries that are struggling with conflict. So I hope that in clarifying that it helps sort of draw a distinguishment between the two topics a little bit better.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. And I just want to thank you again, Samantha. It was really a very enlightening evening, I think. And we learned a lot. And it's a different perspective on global health than we've had in the past. And I really appreciated it for that particular reason. So it's kind of hard for us to give you the kind of applause that you deserve for this. But some of us could put on our videos and give you a, that's good, there you go, there's a thumbs up, or just unmute and clap a little bit. But I think that we really appreciate the time that you put into your presentation and all that we learned here tonight. So let me just say a few words about next week. So next week, Annie Lynn, who's a member of the External Advisory Committee of the Global Public Health Program, is going to be with us from Washington, D.C., and she's going to be talking about driving down malaria through proactive community care management. So we'll be talking about malaria, and Annie Lynn, who's done some amazing work in Senegal in that regard, is going to be sharing her experiences with us next week at the same time. So I look